An elderly woman was abandoned at a nursing home by her biological children, but her adopted son did something surprising. The cold morning air seeped through the cracks in the poorly sealed window, invading the small room with white walls that felt more like a hospital than a home. Mrs. Lucia, 78 years old, sat in her rocking chair, her eyes lost in the curtains swaying gently with the wind. The fluttering fabric seemed to be the only thing moving in that room, frozen by abandonment. Her thin fingers, marked by the wrinkles of decades of hard work and sacrifice, tightly held a rosary, as if it were her last anchor of hope. Time in the nursing home passed slowly, and the silence was broken only by the distant sounds of nurses going from room to room, attending to other patients. But for Mrs. Lucia, the silence was deafening. Her gaze wandered around the room, where there were no family photos, no objects that spoke of her past life. Only a simple crucifix hung on the wall, a solemn reminder that her faith was all she had left. She whispered softly, words that were almost a prayer, but also a confession. "I gave everything for them." Her voice, once strong and full of life, was now trembling, weighed down by the years and the pain she had carried. With each sentence, a silent tear rolled down her face, tracing the path of her sorrow. How could they forget me like this? The truth was too hard to bear. She had been a devoted mother, spending sleepless nights nursing fevers, preparing meals, comforting broken hearts. Lucia had always believed that her children would love her the same way she loved them. Each one of them, Pedro, Carolina, and Marta, had been her treasure. When her husband passed away, she clung to those family ties like a lifeline, believing they would never leave her to face the world alone. But now, sitting there in the sterile cold of the nursing home, reality was unavoidable. They had moved on with their lives, and the contact they kept was sporadic and distant. Pedro, the oldest, visited when his schedule allowed, which amounted to rare appearances. Carolina, always busy with work and her own children, seemed to have no time to remember the mother who had raised her. Marta, the youngest, whose lively spirit once filled the house with joy, now only sent short messages on birthdays, never committing to a visit. The words were always the same, empty of real meaning. "As soon as I can, I'll come see you, Mom." Mrs. Lucia lowered her head, her frail shoulders shaking with a sob she tried to hide. The pain of abandonment was something she never imagined. At first, she tried to justify her children's distance, telling herself that life was busy, that they all had their own responsibilities. But now, the truth was too stark to ignore. They had forgotten her. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not out of malice, but the result was the same. She was alone. "I lost my entire life for them," she murmured again, bitterness lacing every word. "What did I do to deserve this? Did I really make so many mistakes?" The rosary slipped from her fingers, falling into her lap. It was a question she had asked herself countless times during the long, lonely nights when she tossed and turned in the empty bed with no one to answer her. Maybe her children would never truly know how much she loved them, how much she had sacrificed so they could have a better future. Maybe a mother's love wasn't enough to protect her from being forgotten. The clock in the hallway chimed, but Dona Lucia didn't move. She just stayed there, lost in her small world of memories and prayers, waiting for a sign that, somehow, she wasn't completely alone. The prayers she whispered were all she had left. She prayed for her children, that God would touch their hearts, that maybe one day they'd remember who the woman was that gave them life. But deep down, a bitter voice whispered that perhaps it was already too late. The wind blew hard that cold winter afternoon. The cemetery was covered in a thin mist, as if the sky itself was mourning along with those saying their goodbyes. The loss of a husband, a companion for decades, weighed heavy on Dona Lucia's heart. At the foot of the grave, her children stood by her side. Pedro, the eldest, remained stoic, his face tense, trying to hold back the emotions he believed he shouldn't show. Carolina and Marta were crying, but when Lucia looked at them, she didn't see the same despair she felt inside. For her, this wasn't just the loss of a husband. It was the end of an era of everything they had built together. As the final prayers echoed in the damp air, Pedro took his mother's hand, his voice low and steady, trying to offer comfort. "We'll take care of you, Mom. We'll never leave you alone." His face was serious, but the weight of his words was clear to her. Lucia looked at him and, for a brief moment, believed that despite the loss, she wouldn't be completely abandoned. She knew her children were busy with their own lives, but in that moment, it felt like there was a promise that family love would prevail. Carolina, still wiping away her tears with a handkerchief, echoed her brother's words. "Yes, Mom, don't worry. We'll always be around." Marta, with her big, expressive eyes, nodded silently. On their faces, there was a kind of automatic determination, as if they were reaffirming something that should have always been obvious. Taking care of their parents was a duty. And so, Dona Lucia accepted these promises like a lifeline amidst her grief. But as the months went by, Dona Lucia's health began to decline. First, it was small memory lapses, then problems with mobility. The doctor's visits became more frequent, and soon she could no longer take care of herself. It was during this time that the conversations between her children began to change. The tone of the promises Pedro, Carolina, and Marta had made that day at the cemetery now seemed as distant as the echo of their voices when they made them. Gathered in the living room of Pedro's house, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Carolina kept adjusting her glasses frequently, a gesture that showed her discomfort, while Pedro stood with his arms crossed, as if waiting for a practical solution to the problem they were now facing. Marta, sitting on the couch, fiddled with her hair, clearly impatient and wanting to escape the conversation. "We can't ignore this anymore, Pedro. She needs constant help." Carolina was the first to speak, breaking the oppressive silence. There was a sense of urgency in her voice. "I have the kids and my job. I can't take care of her all the time. We need to do something." Marta, who had always been the most sensitive to their mother's suffering, glanced sideways at her two siblings. "I can try to help more, but I'm not in a position to do it. My place is small, and I have my job too." Pedro, always pragmatic and focused on finding direct solutions, rubbed his face before replying. "We're not prepared for this. I've talked to some friends. A nursing home could be a temporary solution, just until we get things sorted. She would have professional care there." Marta quickly turned, her face twisted in anger and disbelief. "Are you suggesting we leave our mother in a nursing home? After everything she's done for us?" Carolina, sighing, tried to calm the situation. "Marta, it's not that simple. We all have our responsibilities. She needs the kind of attention that, honestly, none of us can provide right now. It's not fair. She's your mother too. I'm not saying I can do everything on my own, but this is wrong." Marta stood up, pacing the room with her arms crossed, as if trying to hold back her emotions. She knew there was truth in what Carolina said, but the feeling of betrayal was too strong to ignore. Pedro also got up, pacing back and forth, trying to maintain control of the situation. "We're talking about 24/7 care. Do you think you have time for that? The nursing home has the structure, nurses. It's not like we're abandoning her. It's for her own good. You want her in a place where no family will be around? Do you really think that's what's best for her?" Marta shouted, her voice thick with frustration. She felt that putting their mother in a home was like giving up, like pushing her to the sidelines of their lives, far away, so they wouldn't have to face the reality of her aging. Pedro, exhausted, shook his head, his patience running out. Let's be realistic, Marta. Neither of us is capable of taking care of her full time. At least there, she'll be safe. It's not about what we want, it's about what we can do." The silence that followed was painful. Marta was breathing heavily, tears welling up in her eyes, while Carolina seemed to sink deeper into the couch, ashamed that she couldn't do more. They all knew Pedro was right, but the decision weighed heavily on them. After that day, time passed, and Dona Lucia was taken to the nursing home, with promises that it would be temporary, that they would visit her every week, that she would never be left alone. But like so many promises, these too were broken. The visits became less frequent, and the children's presence grew more and more sporadic until weeks turned into months. What was meant to be a temporary solution quickly became Dona Lucia's permanent home. With each passing day, her room at the nursing home felt colder, the promises more distant, and Dona Lucia felt lonelier. The days at the nursing home seemed to stretch on, as if time itself had decided to slow down. Once an active and involved woman, Dona Lucia now spent her days staring out the small window in her room, watching the slow movement of the clouds and the trees swaying gently in the wind. She still held on to the hope that one day her children would walk through the gates of the nursing home. But each day they didn't show up made that hope fade a little more, like a candle burning down to its last bit of wick. November arrived, bringing Dona Lucia's birthday. Nurse Anna, a woman with a compassionate heart and kind spirit, knew it was a special day. She was one of the few people in that place who truly noticed the quiet suffering of the elderly woman. That morning, Anna entered the room with a gentle smile, carrying a small slice of cake she had baked the night before. She placed it delicately on the table beside Dona Lucia's bed. "Happy birthday, Dona Lucia," Anna said softly. Her eyes searched for a hint of joy on the elderly woman's face, but all she found was a sad smile, a shadow of what could have been a happy moment. "Thank you, Anna," Lucia replied, her voice weak. She knew Anna was trying, and she was grateful for that, but the emptiness left by her children's absence was a constant ache that no kind gesture could ease. "Today's a special day, isn't it? Your children must be on their way to celebrate with you," Anna said, trying to stay optimistic, though she already knew the truth. She knew the visits from Dona Lucia's children had become rare. They had promised to come on special occasions, but now, even on birthdays, they left their mother waiting. Mrs. Lucia smiled bitterly and turned her gaze toward the window. "They must be busy as always." Anna, noticing the sadness in her words, sighed. She wanted to say something, perhaps something that could comfort the elderly woman, but she knew there were no words that could erase the pain of being forgotten. "I'll make you a cup of tea," she said before leaving the room, once again leaving Mrs. Lucia alone with her memories. The afternoon dragged on, and Mrs. Lucia remained seated by the window, her eyes lost on the horizon. Each time she heard a noise from the hallway, she would lift her head, hoping to hear the voice of one of her children. But each time the door opened, it was only a nurse or one of the other residents passing by. The hours slowly ticked by. The sun began to set, painting the world outside in shades of orange and red. And with it, Mrs. Lucia's heart sank a little deeper. Christmas celebrations weren't any different. December arrived with its lights and music, and the nursing home tried to create a festive atmosphere, but the sadness of those who had been left behind hung over everything. Christmas was supposed to be a time for togetherness, but for Lucia, it was a painful reminder that her family was falling apart. The promise of a special visit for Christmas was left unfulfilled, and she spent that quiet evening sitting on her bed, watching the decorated Christmas tree in the home's main hall, her only company being her prayers. "God, why have they left me like this?" Mrs. Lucia murmured to the ceiling of her dark room, clutching her rosary tightly. I just wanted my children to love me enough to be with me. I just wanted them to remember me." Her voice cracked, and she felt the warmth of tears rolling down her cheeks. The silence that followed was overwhelming. In the days that followed, as the new year approached, Mrs. Lucia began to lose whatever hope she had left that her life would change. Loneliness had a physical weight, like a heavy cloud that followed her everywhere. It was hard not to wonder what she had done wrong, how her life, once so full of joy and love for her children, had turned into this empty, forgotten existence. It was around this time that Anna started spending more time with her. Sensitive to the elderly woman's pain, the nurse decided she wouldn't let Mrs. Lucia sink completely into her loneliness. She brought her tea, sat down to talk, and often just stayed by her side in silence, respecting her grief. During one of these visits, Anna noticed that the elderly woman's gaze seemed more distant than usual. "Your children will come back, Mrs. Lucia," Anna said, trying once again to offer some comfort. She pulled up a chair next to the bed and gently held the elderly woman's hand. "Sometimes God has his own plans. He works in silence, but he's always listening to us." Donna Lucia closed her eyes for a moment, as if she were trying to absorb those words. But when she opened them again, the sadness was still there, deeply rooted. "Miracles, Anna?" she replied, her voice filled with skepticism. "I pray every day. I beg God for my children to remember me, for them to come see me. But all I see are days and more days passing, and no one comes." The tears she had been trying to hold back started to fall again. "I just want my children back. Nothing more." Anna squeezed Donna Lucia's hand tighter, feeling the pain radiating from her like an invisible current. "God has a plan, Donna Lucia," Anna insisted, her eyes filled with faith. "Sometimes it's through pain that he reveals the greatest miracles. Have faith, because the love you gave your children is still there, somewhere. You might not see it right now, but love never disappears." Donna Lucia didn't respond, only nodded slightly. Deep inside, she wanted to believe Anna's words. She wanted to feel that somewhere in the darkness, there was a light waiting to guide her. But with every passing day, every important date forgotten, it became harder to hold on to that belief. The silence between the two women lingered for a few minutes, until Anna stood up and, with a gentle smile, said goodbye to continue with her work. Once again, Donna Lucia was left alone, with only the cold afternoon wind as her company. As the last rays of the sun faded, she whispered one final prayer before falling asleep. Maybe somewhere someone was listening. The gray afternoon hovered over the nursing home, and the winter seemed harsher that year. Donna Lucia spent more and more time in silence, sinking into memories that surfaced during her loneliest moments. The window in her room, with its limited view, had become her only connection to the outside world. But she knew there was another world, one deeper and more intimate, where memories could be relived with painful clarity. And amid that stream of memories, there was one figure who, despite the years of forced distance, had never disappeared from her heart. João, her adopted son. João wasn't Donna Lucia's biological son. He had been taken in by her and her husband decades ago, when he was still a 6-year-old boy, orphaned and lost. João had been abandoned to his fate in a poor orphanage, lost in the system, invisible to most, but not to Lucia and her husband. In his big, scared eyes, they saw an opportunity to give him the love they needed to share. The couple already had 3 children, Pedro, Carolina, and Marta. But from the very first moment, João became part of their home with the same intensity as any bond of blood. The memory of how he came into their lives was vivid in Lucia's mind. She remembered the first dinner, when João, still shy, barely touched his food, afraid that at any moment someone would tell him that the meal wasn't for him. that the place didn't belong to him. But over time, he began to relax, to smile, and to play with his siblings. Lucia remembered their laughter, their games in the yard, the bedtime stories she would tell, where João always asked to be the hero. Still, despite the love and care that Lucia and her husband gave to João, the relationship with their biological children was never entirely harmonious. From a young age, Pedro, Carolina, and Marta had shown signs of jealousy, a subtle tension that grew as they got older. They never said it outright, but the fact that João was adopted, a stranger, always lingered in the air. The sibling rivalry, which exists in any family, became more complicated here, fueled by the feeling that João was somehow an intruder in a space that should have been theirs alone. Lucia remembered one particularly difficult afternoon when João was about 12. The kids were in the backyard, and from the other side of the house, she could hear the heated voices of an argument. She hurried out, fearing something was wrong, and found João standing there, his face red with anger and suppressed tears. Carolina, always quick with her words, stood with her hands on her hips, while Pedro and Marta watched in silence. "You're not really part of the family. It was just charity from my parents," Carolina had said bluntly, her voice cold with a kind of childhood cruelty that Lucia never knew she was capable of. João stood frozen, the weight of those words crushing him. Lucia's heart ached as she recalled that moment. She had stepped in, scolding Carolina and comforting João. But deep down, she knew that kind of wound was hard to heal completely. João had been quiet about it after that day, but Lucia could see a sadness in his eyes that never fully went away. As the years passed, he began to distance himself, as if he understood that, no matter how much love he received, he could never be fully accepted by his siblings. It wasn't something he said out loud, but it showed in every gesture, in every far-off look he gave when he thought no one was watching. Adolescence brought its own challenges. João, talented and intelligent, pursued his studies with determination, but over time, his relationship with his siblings grew colder. Conversations during family gatherings became formal, and unlike Pedro and Carolina, who married and stayed close by, João moved far away. He settled in another city, focused on his career, and although he stayed in touch with Lucia, his visits became less frequent. He got caught up in his own problems, professional and personal challenges, and without meaning to, let the physical distance turn into emotional distance as well. But Lucia knew, deep down, that João never forgot her. Among all the children, he was the only one who maintained a deeper connection, even if sporadic. In his letters, João still wrote with affection, remembering small details from his childhood and asking about her well-being. The other children, Pedro, Carolina, and Marta, however, never fully accepted João. To them, he was always the adopted one, an extra piece in the puzzle that didn't quite fit, no matter how much Lucia tried to bring them together. Their disregard for him was never loud or obvious, but rather a quiet indifference that João carried with him throughout his life. Mrs. Lucia sighed, her eyes misty with memories. It was a burden she had always carried, the fact that she could never make her 4 children truly accept and love each other as siblings. She didn't blame João for drifting away. Life often pulls people in different directions. Still, she wished that somehow he had stayed closer, especially now when her heart felt so empty. Despite everything, Lucia never stopped thinking of him, and in her nightly prayers, she always asked God to protect him wherever he was. She knew that João, with all his struggles and inner battles, still carried the love she and her late husband had given him. That love was unbreakable, an invisible bridge she hoped could bring him back one day. As the sun set outside and the cold crept into the room, Mrs. Lucia held her rosary tighter and closed her eyes. A solitary tear rolled down her cheek, but this time it wasn't just sadness. It was a mixture of longing and hope. She still believed that Joao, the boy who had once called her mom so sincerely, would find his way back to her. It was an ordinary afternoon at the nursing home. The winter cold seemed to have frozen all movement inside the building, and the muffled sound of nurses' footsteps barely echoed through the silent hallways. Mrs. Lucia sat in her room, once again looking out the window, where the wind rustled the bare trees. The changing seasons no longer brought surprises or hope. The weeks came and went, and the days blended into one monotonous stretch. Lucia no longer expected much from life. She had slowly come to terms with her isolation, feeling more distant each day from the world she once belonged to. Yet, on that particular afternoon, something different happened. A soft knock on the door broke the usual silence, and before she could react, the door slowly creaked open. Mrs. Lucia, not sure what to expect, turned her face toward the doorway, her expression curious but tired. Standing at the threshold, visibly emotional, was Joao. Time seemed to freeze for a moment. They looked at each other in silence, as if both were trying to confirm that the other was truly there, in the same room, after so many years of distance. Joao looked visibly older, his face etched with the battles he had fought over the years. But his eyes still held the same melancholic glow they had when he was a child, a glow that Mrs. Lucia knew all too well. It took her a few seconds to process his presence. Like an unexpected ray of light cutting through the darkness, Joao was standing there, right in front of her, the son she had feared she might never see again. Dona Lucia's heart raced, as if reminding her that life still pulsed inside her. She blinked a few times, confused, not sure if this was just a vision conjured by her tired mind. "Joao," she whispered, her voice trembling, almost unable to believe it. He stepped into the room, saying nothing at first, just staring at his mother. Tears began to form, at first slowly, until they turned into a silent stream. He could no longer control the flood of emotions as he looked at this woman, so fragile and distant after all this time. Joao moved closer, and when he was just a few steps away, he fell to his knees in front of her. "Mom, forgive me." His voice was thick with emotion, hoarse, and he struggled to hold back the tears. "Forgive me for taking so long, for not being here when you needed me the most." Dona Lucia's expression softened immediately, and she reached out her trembling hand, gently touching Joao's face with a tenderness he had never forgotten. Her wrinkled fingers traced a path through his tears, and that soft touch seemed to carry with it all the love and longing that had built up over the years. Her heart, which had once beat slowly, as if it were taking its last breaths, now pulsed with renewed energy. "Joao, you came back." Lucia's voice cracked in the middle of her sentence, a mix of relief and emotion that left her breathless. Her whole life, marked by silence and unanswered prayers, seemed to culminate in this one moment. Her son was back. It wasn't a dream. He was there, kneeling before her, like the boy she once cradled and loved deeply. Joao lowered his head, clutching Dona Lucia's hands tightly, feeling an overwhelming need to make amends. He knew that nothing he said could make up for the years of absence, the years he had let himself be consumed by his own struggles and drifted away from the one who loved him most. I heard about how you were, but I didn't know it was this bad. I thought there was still time. Mom, I was wrong, but I promise I will never leave you alone again." He straightened up slightly, looking into her tear-filled eyes. "Never again?" Dona Lucia pulled Joao closer, wrapping him in an embrace that seemed capable of bridging decades of hurt, distance, and unspoken silences. Her heart, once accustomed to the emptiness, now beat with newfound strength, as if that embrace was the cure she had been waiting for. João, for his part, couldn't hold back the sob that escaped his throat. Feeling the warmth of his mother's embrace, the woman who had welcomed him into her home and given him everything, filled him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt. The silence in the room was broken only by the deep breaths and sighs the two shared in that emotional reunion. Mrs. Lucia, between tears and smiles, touched Joao's face as if she were rediscovering every feature. "I prayed so much, my son. I prayed for you every day. I knew God would bring you back to me. I just didn't know when." Joao, with his eyes filled with tears, lowered his head. "I prayed too, Mom, but I was lost. I let myself get carried away by so many things, by the struggles, and I drifted away from everything that mattered." He took a deep breath, wiping his face with his hands. "I promise that's going to change. I'll take care of you, no matter what happens." In that moment, something inside Mrs. Lucia blossomed. That reunion, as unexpected and late as it was, felt like a divine answer to her prayers. Maybe she didn't have all her children close, but Joao's return, the son who never truly stopped loving her, seemed to light up the path she once thought was lost. As the hours passed, they talked at length, and Joao shared everything that had happened since he had distanced himself. Life hadn't been easy for him. The pain of always being seen as an outsider by Pedro, Carolina, and Marta had weighed on him for many years. He had tried to build a life far away, thinking distance would heal the wounds, but he found that the emptiness only grew. When he heard about Mrs. Lucia's condition, something awoke in him. It was as if a higher calling had pulled him back, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. "God put you in my heart, Mom. I knew I had to come back." Joao sighed, taking his mother's hands again. "I just hope you can forgive me for not coming back sooner." Mrs. Lucia smiled, still feeling the warmth of his touch. "My son, there's nothing to forgive. You were always in my heart, even from afar. And now that you're back, that's all that matters." This reunion brought Mrs. Lucia a new hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The oppressive silence of the nursing home seemed lighter, less cruel. The prayer she had whispered for so long had finally been answered. Joao was back, and with him, a light that brightened the darkness of her lonely days. The reunion between Mrs. Lucia and Joao seemed to bring a new light into her life. Joao's visits became frequent, and he quickly took on the responsibility of caring for her. Within a few weeks, he was already making plans to take her out of the nursing home and bring her to live with him. Mrs. Lucia's joy was palpable, and each time she saw her adopted son walk into the room, her heart filled with hope. It was as if the weight of years of abandonment was finally being lifted. However, Joao's constant presence at the nursing home didn't go unnoticed by the other staff or by Dona Lucia's biological children. Although Pedro, Carolina, and Marta no longer visited their mother as often, or at all, really, rumors had reached them that Joao was getting close to their mother again. Worse still, he seemed to be taking on the role of her primary caregiver. To them, this wasn't just a surprise. It was an insult. Pedro, always the most pragmatic and suspicious of the three, was the first to react. Already struggling with financial difficulties and the pressure of supporting his own family, he began to fear that Joao had ulterior motives. The thought that their adoptive brother might influence their mother and eventually benefit financially gnawed at him. Carolina, who had always harbored some resentment toward Joao, agreed with Pedro. And although Marta had some doubts, she allowed herself to be swayed by her older siblings. The tension came to a head on a cold winter afternoon, when Pedro, Carolina, and Marta decided to visit the nursing home together. Their plan was to confront Joao directly and, if possible, take control of the situation before anything more serious happened. As soon as they entered the nursing home, an uneasy feeling settled over the three of them. The hallway was long and quiet, interrupted only by the occasional sound of footsteps from the nurses. As they approached Dona Lucia's room, they heard voices. That's when they saw the scene they had feared. João was sitting by their mother's bedside, gently holding her hand and speaking calmly. The love in Dona Lucia's eyes for João was unmistakable, which only made Pedro's irritation grow. Without hesitation, Pedro pushed the door open and walked into the room with determined steps, followed closely by Carolina and Marta. Their presence instantly changed the atmosphere in the room. João, who had his back to the door, turned when he heard the footsteps. Dona Lucia, surprised, looked at her three biological children, her eyes filled with emotion, unsure of what to expect from this meeting. Pedro was the first to speak, his voice tense and accusatory. "So, this is how it is? You show up after all these years and think you're the savior." João, who hadn't expected such a direct confrontation, took a deep breath before replying. "Pedro, I'm not here to compete with anyone. I'm here to take care of our mother, whom you've all abandoned." João's response, though calm, was like adding fuel to the fire. Pedro stepped forward, his face reddening with anger. "Don't give me that. You disappeared for years, and now you show up acting like the big hero? You think you can just waltz back into her life and do whatever you want?" Carolina, standing next to Pedro, chimed in, her voice filled with bitterness. "He's taking advantage of the situation, Pedro. He's always been like this. He was never really part of our family, just waiting for an opportunity to benefit." João stood up slowly, keeping his composure, although clearly shaken by his siblings' words. He turned to Mrs. Lucia, who was visibly uncomfortable and distressed by the argument, and tried to keep his voice steady. "I'm not here for money or anything other than love. Our mother has been alone for so long, and no one else has done anything for her. I'm just trying to fix what's been wrong for so long." Marta, who had been silent until then, finally spoke, but her tone was hesitant. "João, we're not saying we don't care about her, but you disappeared, and now you show up out of the blue. It seems like you're trying to take a place that, honestly, isn't yours." João's heart sank at her words, but he knew he had to stay calm to avoid turning the confrontation into something even worse. "Marta, I never wanted to replace anyone. I just want to give our mother the care and love she deserves. Can't you see how she is? Can't you see the pain she's in?" Pedro couldn't hold back anymore. "Care and love? This isn't about her. You're here for one thing, money. You just want to make sure you get your share of the inheritance. Isn't that it? Money." João laughed bitterly, disbelief in his voice. "I don't want anything other than to see our mother well. You're the ones worried about money, but I'm worried about the time she's lost, the time you've left her alone." Mrs. Lucia, who had been silent, taking in every word, finally couldn't hold back the pain she felt seeing her children argue so cruelly. With tears in her eyes, her voice came out low but filled with sorrow. "Enough," she said, her tone weak but enough to make everyone stop and look at her. "Enough," she repeated, this time louder. João looked at his mother with concern, but Pedro and Carolina kept their defiant expressions. "Don't you realize how much this is killing me? This fight, this greed." She paused, trying to control her emotions. "You've distanced yourselves from me. You've left me alone here. And now that João is back to help me, to take care of me, all you can see is money? Is that all I am to you?" Pedro, unsure of what to say, looked away. Carolina, still tense, nervously wrung her hands. Marta, on the other hand, seemed on the verge of tears. João tried to move closer to Mrs. Lucia, but she raised her hand, signaling that she didn't need comfort at that moment. She needed to speak, to let out everything that had been weighing on her heart. I don't want to hear about inheritance fights. That's not what matters. What I always wanted, was to have my family with me. But you all drifted apart, and now that Joao is here, you're treating him like an enemy, as if he's to blame for everything that happened. He gave me something you didn't, his presence. Pedro, still wrestling with his pride, let out a heavy sigh, but remained silent. Deep down, he knew his mother was right, but he didn't know how to admit it. The silence that followed was heavy, almost unbearable. Everyone there knew their relationship had been worn down over the years, but no one wanted to admit how wrong they had been. Joao, still looking at his mother, took a step back, giving her space to regain control of the situation. Finally, Dona Lucia took a deep breath and looked at her 3 biological children, her eyes tired but filled with a sad wisdom. If you can't give me the love I need, at least let me live in peace with those who want to give me that. Joao came back for me, and right now, he's the only one who truly sees me. Dona Lucia's final words hung in the air like a bitter but honest truth. Joao, without saying a word, stepped closer to his mother and held her hand again, this time with a calm silence. The siblings, overwhelmed by guilt, didn't know how to respond. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta were losing something they hadn't even realized they had: their mother's unconditional love. The silence that settled over the room after the confrontation was thick, like a fog no one knew how to clear. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta just stood there, unsure of how to respond to the harsh words they had just heard. Dona Lucia, sitting on the bed, looked at her children, but her eyes no longer held the sweetness they once did. Now, they carried the weight of years of accumulated pain. She had raised them, protected them, sacrificed her own happiness countless times to make sure they had everything they needed. And yet, here she was, alone in a nursing home, depending on nurses and Joao, the only one who came back for her. There was so much that needed to be said, and even though she knew her words would be painful, now was the time to speak the truth. Dona Lucia took a deep breath, feeling the weight of all the emotions she had held inside for so long, and decided she couldn't keep it in any longer. "It's time you heard what I've been holding in for a long time." Her frail voice echoed in the small room. Her 3 children looked up at the same time, as if snapped out of their own thoughts. Joao, still by her side, remained silent, knowing this was his mother's moment to speak. She paused, gathering the strength she needed to continue. "I've spent my entire life dedicating every moment, every thought, and every action to you all. Ever since you were little, all I ever wanted was for you to be happy, to have a better life than mine. And I achieved that. But somewhere along the way, you forgot about me." Her voice trembled for a moment, but she held firm, her determination clear. "I didn't want much. I just wanted to be part of your lives. I wanted to be there for your achievements, your struggles, your moments. But suddenly, I found myself growing more and more distant, more forgotten." Pedro, with his arms crossed, stared at the floor, visibly uncomfortable. Carolina ran her hand through her hair, a nervous gesture, and Marta glanced at Joao as if searching for an answer, but he remained silent, respecting their mother's moment. Dona Lucia continued, tears slowly welling up in her tired eyes. "I know your lives are busy. I know each of you has your own family, your kids, your problems. But that's no excuse to leave me here, abandoned, as if I no longer exist." She sighed deeply, wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. "All I wanted was love, to see you, to hug you, to hear your voices. That was enough for me. But you came less and less, until you stopped coming altogether. Dona Lucia's words hung heavy in the air, undeniable in their truth. Deep down, the three children knew she was right. Even though they could justify their absences with commitments, kids, or work, it didn't change the fact that their mother had been left alone. Marta, her eyes brimming with tears, looked like she was about to speak, but remained silent, choked by guilt. Dona Lucia looked at them with a mix of sadness and resolve. You talk about inheritance, about material things, but the only thing I ever wanted was love. And that, you denied me. You were too busy, and in the middle of all of it, you forgot about me. And now, when Joao came back, after years of none of you being by my side, you come here and accuse him of wanting something from me? Carolina, always the most practical and direct, tried to respond, though hesitantly. Mom, it's not that we don't care. We just think he might be taking advantage. Taking advantage? Dona Lucia interrupted, her voice firm. Taking advantage of what? Of me, who has almost nothing left to give. What is he gaining by spending time with me here, caring for me, when you aren't? Joao may not be related by blood, but he's the only one who saw my pain. He's the only one who came back. Pedro, who had been trying to keep his expression controlled, finally broke the silence. But Mom, he's not part of the family like we are. He's always been an outsider, someone who... Mrs. Lucia interrupted him again, this time more firmly. Enough, Pedro. Family isn't just about blood. Family is about who stands by your side during hard times, who reaches out when you're falling. Family is the ones who love and take care of you. And Joao did that for me. He did what you all promised to do, but didn't. Her words hit hard. Pedro, always proud, felt the walls of logic he had built around himself start to crumble. Carolina, who always hid behind excuses, finally felt the weight of her absence. And Marta, the most sensitive of the three, cried silently, unable to hide the pain she had been bottling up. Mrs. Lucia took a deep breath, trying to regain control over the emotions bubbling up inside her. I forgive you, she said, her voice softer, though still heavy with sadness. I forgive you because I know your lives haven't been easy either, and I know each of you carries your own burdens. But you need to understand that a mother's love doesn't disappear. It's still there, even when you don't see it, even when you push it aside. She looked at Joao, who remained by her side, silent, but with eyes full of compassion. And as for Joao, he didn't come here to take anything from me. He came because he loves me, and that's what matters. I don't want fights. I don't want arguments. I just want peace. And if you want to stay in my life, then give me that peace. Let me live what's left of my life with love, with presence, with whoever is willing to be with me. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta stood still, weighed down by a heavy silence full of guilt. None of them knew what to say. Their mother's words struck deep, forcing them to face the reality of their actions, or rather, their lack of action. Joao, sensing that his mother had said everything she needed to, gently squeezed her hand. Mrs. Lucia looked at him with gratitude, feeling strengthened by her adoptive son's quiet support. Deep down, she knew that a complete reconciliation with her other children would take time, but in that moment, she had finally spoken all the truths she had held in for so long. And that, in itself, was freeing. The silence in the room lingered, but this time, it wasn't the same silence as before. It was a silence of reflection, of understanding. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta, though still processing everything they had heard, knew that from that day on, something had to change. Feeling more at ease, Mrs. Lucia leaned back against the bed, exhausted but relieved. She had finally let out the truth that had been trapped in her chest for so long. And as she looked at Joao, for the first time in a long while, She felt she was exactly where she needed to be, surrounded by those who truly loved her. That night, the nursing home was wrapped in a peculiar, almost supernatural calm. The silence, which had once felt oppressive to Mrs. Lucia, now seemed different. There was something in the air, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. After her heart-to-heart with her children, a sense of peace began to grow within her. There were still scars, of course, and she knew the wounds between her and her family wouldn't heal overnight. But in that moment, she felt relieved for having said everything she needed to say. Finally, the truth was out, and in a way that brought her serenity. João had left after spending hours by her side, holding her hand and assuring her that he would never leave her alone again. The affection and commitment he showed were a clear answer to the prayers Dona Lucia had made for so many years. Although her relationship with Pedro, Carolina, and Marta was still fractured, she now felt supported. There was something stronger than blood connecting her to João, and that gave her the strength to carry on. Lying in her bed, Dona Lucia held her rosary, as she did every night. The ritual of prayer had always been a constant in her life, a direct line between her and God. The room was dark, lit only by the faint light of the moon coming through the slightly open window. The winter chill was biting, but, strangely, she felt warm, as if an invisible presence was with her in that moment. Dona Lucia began her prayers, as she did every night. "Our Father, who art in heaven," she murmured, her soft voice filling the empty room. The words, repeated so many times over the years, brought comfort and security. As she recited each verse, the physical and emotional exhaustion seemed to fade away. She felt a growing calm, a sense that something greater was about to happen. She closed her eyes, continuing her prayers. "God, I give you everything I carry, the longing, the sadness, and even the hope. Take care of my children as I have always asked, and now, take care of me too." Her voice wavered, and she gripped the rosary tighter, feeling each bead pass through her fingers, as if each one carried a piece of her soul. And then something happened. A deeper silence fell over the room. The air seemed to stand still, as if time itself had paused. Dona Lucia felt a gentle warmth surround her body, a warmth that didn't come from the blankets or the distant heater. It was something spiritual, something she had never felt with such intensity before. With her eyes still closed, Dona Lucia heard a soft sound, like a light breeze passing through the room, even though the windows were shut. And then, as if in a dream, she sensed a presence. The feeling was so clear it felt real. It wasn't just the imagination of a tired mind. There was something there, with her, in the room. A soft light began to glow behind her closed eyelids, and a deep sense of peace enveloped her. Dona Lucia slowly opened her eyes, and what she saw left her speechless. Standing beside the bed was the figure of her late husband, dressed in white, with a serene smile on his lips. He looked young again, strong, with the same sparkle in his eyes that she remembered from so many years ago. Time, or death, hadn't erased the tenderness in his gaze. "Lucia." His voice was soft, like the echo of a cherished memory. "You were never alone." Tears streamed down Dona Lucia's face, but they weren't of sadness. It was an emotion so deep it couldn't be put into words. She tried to speak, but her voice failed, her chest tight with the surprise and love that seeing her husband again brought her. "I've always been with you," he continued, coming closer to the bed and holding her hand with the same tenderness as when they were together, alive, in the early years of their marriage. "The love you gave, Lucia, it was never in vain. Not the love you gave our children, not the love you gave João. Everything you planted, one day it will bloom." Still in shock, Dona Lucia stammered, I I prayed so much. I asked for this so many times." Her voice was a whisper, but her husband heard her clearly. "And God listened, my dear," he said, the soft smile never leaving his face. Sometimes, answers come in ways we don't expect. You thought you were abandoned, but you weren't. Joao came back because God called him. And your other children, they too will feel the call. But more than anything, you need to know that true love always prevails. It never dies. His words floated in the air like music, and Dona Lucia felt lighter than ever before. She still held her rosary, but the tightness in her chest, the pain and suffering had vanished. She knew, with a deep certainty, that her husband was right. The love she had always given to the world had not been in vain. Even through the deepest pains, even in the harshest loneliness, love had survived. "I'll be waiting for you," he said softly, his gaze full of understanding. "But it's not your time yet. You have more to live for, more love to receive." Dona Lucia smiled, even as the tears still streamed down her face. "I missed you so much," she whispered. He looked at her with tenderness and replied, "I never left, Lucia. I've always been here, by your side. And when the time comes, we'll be together again. Until then, remember, you are not alone." The light around him began to glow brighter, and slowly, his image started to fade, like a soft mist disappearing at dawn. Dona Lucia didn't try to hold on to him. She knew, deep in her heart, that his love had never left her, just as her love for their children and for Joao would continue, despite all the hardships. When her vision faded completely, Mrs. Lucia lay down again, feeling a deep serenity she hadn't experienced in a long time. The room returned to its usual state, and the silence of the nursing home was the only sound filling the air. But inside her, everything had changed. She closed her eyes, still holding the rosary, and an unshakable peace filled her heart. Her husband's words echoed in her mind. Love never dies. That night, Mrs. Lucia fell asleep with a smile on her lips, knowing that, even in her greatest trials, God had never abandoned her. And now, more than ever, she was sure that the love she had been searching for was still all around her, waiting to blossom again in ways she could never have imagined. The days following Mrs. Lucia's vision were marked by an inner peace she had never known before. Even the cold halls of the nursing home seemed less oppressive, and the pain of abandonment, which had once seemed unbearable, had turned into something more distant. She still missed her children, still thought about the time they had lost, but something inside her had shifted. She knew that, on some level, her prayer had been answered, and that even in the darkest of circumstances, God was guiding her. Meanwhile, the lives of Pedro, Carolina, and Marta also began to unfold in unexpected ways. The burden of selfishness and indifference they had carried for so long was beginning to take its toll. Pedro, always the most practical and focused on material success, started to feel the weight of the choices he had made. After his last visit to the nursing home, something inside him had changed. His mother's words echoed constantly in his mind, especially those about the true meaning of family and love. For weeks, he tried to push those thoughts away, diving even deeper into his work. But fate didn't seem willing to let him escape so easily. Shortly after the confrontation with Joao and his mother, Pedro faced a series of financial problems he had never anticipated. A failed corporate merger ended up costing him his job, and with that, his financial stability began to crumble. Projects failed, investments that once seemed promising fell apart, and for the first time in years, he found himself without control over his life. The pragmatism that had always been his strength now felt like a weakness. Without his work to rely on, Pedro painfully realized the emptiness he had built around himself. It wasn't just the material loss that struck him. It was the recognition that, in his relentless pursuit of success, he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered: his mother. Sitting in his empty living room, Pedro muttered to himself, "I've lost everything, everything that mattered." He thought of his mother, of how she had begged for love, and a deep pain overwhelmed him. For the first time in a long while, he realized he needed to change. But was there still time to fix what had been broken? Carolina also began to feel the weight of her choices. Always busy with work and her children, she had justified her absence in Dona Lucia's life with excuses about not having enough time and too many responsibilities. However, after visiting the nursing home, her mother's words pierced her mind like thorns. Since that day, Carolina could no longer shake off the feeling of guilt. She looked at her children, her own responsibilities, and realized that one day they might treat her the same way, with indifference and distance. The arguments in her house began to escalate. Her marriage, already fragile due to emotional distance, started to crumble for good. Her husband, tired of the fights and the lack of connection, asked for a divorce. Carolina, who had always considered herself strong and independent, now found herself alone, without the emotional support she had always assumed would be there. One night, after putting her children to bed, she sat in her empty living room and began to cry quietly. She wasn't just crying over the failed marriage, but over the realization that, just as she was losing her own family, she had abandoned the one who had always been there for her, her mother. "I should have been there," she whispered through tears, while looking at an old photo of her mother with her and her siblings. "My mother gave us so much, and we repaid her with indifference." Marta, the most sensitive of the three, had already been deeply shaken by their mother's words on the day of the confrontation. Since then, her conscience weighed on her more with each passing day. Unlike the others, Marta had always been closer to Dona Lucia when she was younger. But over time, life had pulled her away, and she, without realizing it, had also become part of the cycle of neglect. Her mother's words, that love isn't measured by blood but by actions, echoed in her mind constantly. Unlike Pedro and Carolina, Marta began trying to reconnect with her mother. She started calling the nursing home more often, asking about her and making plans to visit. But at the same time, guilt still consumed her. She knew the damage had already been done and that reconciling with her mother would be a long and painful process. While the biological children dealt with their own pain, João, on the other hand, continued to care for Dona Lucia with dedication. He, who had always felt like an outsider in the family, was now the one most present. The critical looks from his siblings, their mistrust, no longer bothered him. Deep down, he knew that his return had nothing to do with material things. All he wanted was to make up for lost time and give the woman who had loved him so much a life filled with dignity and love in her final years. And so, Dona Lucia's days started to get better. Despite her age and fragility, she felt lighter, more complete. Seeing her husband that night had brought her an indescribable peace, and João's constant presence was a comfort to her weary heart. Although she still missed her other children, she knew that love, in some way, would bring her family back together, even if the process was slow and painful. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta began to realize that they weren't being punished by some external force, but by their own choices. Pedro's loss of his professional position, Carolina's divorce, and the emotional burden Marta carried were all consequences of years of neglect and distorted priorities. Deep down, they all knew that to find some kind of redemption, they would have to seek their mother's forgiveness. The first to take the step was Pedro. After weeks of reflection, he decided to return to the nursing home. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to do something. When he entered his mother's room, he saw João sitting beside her, talking calmly. What once would have stirred jealousy and distrust in him now brought a mix of shame and regret. Dona Lucia looked at Pedro with surprise as he entered, but her gaze wasn't one of reproach. It was one of curiosity, perhaps even hope. Joao, sensing his brother's presence, quietly stood up, giving Pedro space to come closer. Pedro took a deep breath, the words struggling to come out. "Mom, I've lost everything, and now I see that what I lost the most was you." He knelt beside her bed, taking her hand with a reverence he had never shown before. "I know I was wrong, that I've been absent, but I'm here now. If you can still forgive me, I promise I'll do whatever it takes to be a better son." Dona Lucia, with a soft smile, gently caressed her son's face. "Pedro, my son, I've always forgiven you. I just wanted you to be with me. Money doesn't matter. The losses don't matter. What matters is that you're here." Finally allowing himself to cry, Pedro felt the weight of years of selfishness and pride dissolve in his tears. He was no longer fighting for power, status, or control. He was there, simply as a son, seeking the love of the mother he had always had, but had never known how to appreciate. And so, the path to redemption began. Although the process of reconciliation would be long, both for Pedro and for Carolina and Marta, divine justice was being served, not through punishment, but through the recognition of their faults and the pursuit of forgiveness. The weeks that followed Pedro's visit brought slow but profound change in Dona Lucia's life. The reunion between mother and son, marked by tears of regret and sincere words, paved the way for a healing process she never imagined possible. The love she had longed for was starting to bloom again, not just through Joao, but also through her biological children, who were gradually coming to terms with the weight of their mistakes. Pedro, after his confession and request for forgiveness, started visiting his mother regularly. He no longer had the stable job or the status he once did, but ironically, it was this lack of power and success that made him more human, closer to what he should have been all along. With each visit, Pedro didn't bring material gifts, but rather his presence. And for Dona Lucia, that was worth more than anything else he could offer. Carolina and Marta also couldn't ignore the transformation. Carolina, still dealing with the weight of her recent divorce, began to realize that she needed real, meaningful connections. She had invested so much time in her career and her own world, but now she was trying to reconnect with her mother. Her first visit was tough. Her pride still fought against acknowledging her mistakes. But as soon as she sat by Dona Lucia's bed, she was overtaken by the same vulnerability that Pedro had experienced. "Mom, I've been so busy with everything, with work, the kids. I thought you'd understand, that you knew I loved you even so." Her words were hesitant but genuine. "I realize now that being busy was never an excuse. I should have done more." Dona Lucia, always generous with her love, reached out to Carolina, holding her hand gently. "My daughter, what's done is done. What matters is that you're here now." Her forgiveness wasn't just a word. It was a complete acceptance that past mistakes could be left behind, as long as love was rediscovered in the present. Marta, the most sensitive and the one who had always felt the most guilt, was the last to reconnect with their mother. She had already begun the process of reaching out since the confrontation with Joao, and arrived at the nursing home full of emotions. When Marta entered Dona Lucia's room, her eyes were already red from crying. She sat beside her mother, holding the thin, wrinkled hands that had once lovingly cared for her as a child. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for everything," Marta said, sobbing. "I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted to leave you alone." Dona Lucia wiped away her daughter's tears with gentle fingers, smiling with that unwavering love she had always had for her children. "Marta, my dear, I know. I've always known. The love never disappeared, neither mine for you nor yours for me. And that's what matters." The family bonds, which once seemed irreparably broken, were slowly being stitched back together, thread by thread, through forgiveness and reconnection. Joao, who had always been present throughout this process, watched quietly. He never sought the spotlight, only the well-being of the woman who had raised him. Now, seeing his siblings finally draw closer to Dona Lucia, he felt a deep sense of relief. He knew that despite all their differences, their mother's love was something they all shared in their own way. Even so, the dynamic had changed. João was now the main caregiver for Dona Lucia, and that was a reality that Pedro, Carolina, and Marta, despite their efforts, would have to accept. It wasn't a matter of competition, but rather a recognition that, during the years they were absent, João had been the only one to fill the void they left behind. One day, during a visit when all the siblings were gathered, Pedro, still struggling to deal with the sting of his wounded pride, looked at João with an expression that was a mix of acknowledgement and discomfort. "João, I think we all owe you an apology. I was unfair. To you?" Pedro hesitated for a moment, but continued. "I know you just wanted to take care of our mother, and you did what we should have done from the beginning." João, who had never sought validation from his siblings, nodded, accepting the words calmly. "I never wanted to take anyone's place, Pedro. I just wanted to make sure she had someone by her side. It was the least I could do." Carolina and Marta, silently, nodded in agreement. There was an unspoken understanding among all of them that, despite the wounds of the past, the most important thing now was Dona Lucia's well-being. It no longer mattered who was right or wrong. What truly mattered was that, in some way, they were together again. A few months later, João decided it was time to bring Dona Lucia to live with him. The nursing home had been a refuge during the time she was neglected, but now, with love restored and the constant presence of her children, Dona Lucia deserved to spend her last years in a place that felt like a real home. Pedro, Carolina, and Marta didn't object. They knew that João was the most capable of taking care of her at that point. But more than that, they knew Dona Lucia wanted to live with João. "He gave me everything I needed when you were far away," she had told her children during a conversation. "Now, I want to be with him." So, João brought Dona Lucia to his home, a modest place, but full of love. There, she spent her days surrounded by care, laughter, and João's constant company, as he never left her side. Her biological children, now more present in her life, visited regularly, joining in on moments they had missed before. The wound was still there, but the healing process, though slow, had begun. The end of Dona Lucia's story wasn't perfect, but it was filled with peace. The last years of her life were spent with the love she had always longed for. João, the adopted son who had always felt like an outsider, had become the heart of her new family. And her biological children, who had neglected her for so long, began to understand that true love isn't about blood, but about presence, actions, and choices. In the end, on a sunny spring day, Dona Lucia passed away peacefully, surrounded by her children. João held her hand as she took her last breath, a calm smile on her lips, knowing that love, in the end, had triumphed. Dona Lucia's burial was simple but full of meaning. Pedro, Carolina, Marta, and João, united by grief but also by the love they had finally found, said their goodbyes with heavy hearts, but at peace. There were no more resentments or conflicts, just the understanding that, in the end, the only inheritance that truly mattered was the love Dona Lucia had planted in each of them. And that love, at last, had bloomed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you as well. Click to keep watching.